I finished orientation at BioClean Services on a Tuesday morning in late April, 11 months after I walked out of Cedar Ridge. The training took 1 day. They called it trauma remediation, biohazard restoration, post-loss cleanup. A lot of words that didn't change what the job actually was. You cleaned up after people who died in their homes. You wore Tyvek and respirators, and you scraped what was left of someone's last day off the floor, and then you sealed it in red bags and logged the weight. The man who offered me the position was named Frank Baker. He ran the Seattle branch out of a converted tire shop on Airport Way South. His office smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. He'd asked about my experience with biohazard protocols, whether I had a problem with confined spaces, whether I could work nights if a job required it. Standard questions. Then he'd slid a contract across the desk and said the pay was $16 an hour to start, $18 after 90 days if the work was solid. I'd said yes before he asked about the gap. That was the sequencing that mattered. He didn't ask where I'd been for the last 6 years until after I'd already signed. And when he did ask, he asked it the way you ask about a previous job that didn't work out, about Cedar Ridge. I told him the truth anyway. He'd nodded once and said the company didn't run background checks on contractors, just on the people who handled the billing. That gate had been in front of every other job I'd applied for since March. Baker left it open. That's why I stayed. I met Ryan Robinson that same afternoon. He'd been with BioClean for 8 months already. Quiet, methodical, big through the shoulders in a way that made the Tyvek suits look like they didn't quite fit. He had the same Cedar Ridge flatness in his eyes that I'd probably had in mine. Not dead, just steady. The look you got from deciding that the only way through anything was straight ahead, and then practicing that decision until it became your whole face. We hadn't been close inside. Different blocks, different schedules. I knew his name because everyone knew his name. Aggravated assault. He'd done years, kept his head down, and didn't make problems. Now we were close because we were the only 2 people willing to do this job for this wage. That's a kind of closeness. Not friendship exactly, but something functional that looked like it from the outside. The work was straightforward once you understood the system. A call came in, usually from a property manager, sometimes from family, occasionally from the police if the scene had already been cleared. You drove to the address. You assessed the scope. You wrote up the estimate if the client wanted one, or you just started if they'd already agreed to pay. You removed everything that couldn't be salvaged. You cleaned what could. You sealed the bags, logged the weight, and drove them to the medical waste incinerator off Highway 18. Then you went home. Ryan and I didn't talk much the first few weeks. We worked 4 jobs together in May. A kitchen in Renton, a bathroom in Kent, a studio apartment near the airport where the tenant had been gone long enough that the neighbors had called it in, and a prefab ranch in Auburn where the family wanted us to box up the deceased's clothes after we'd finished with the carpet. The jobs all had the same rhythm. You showed up, you did the work, you left. Ryan moved through each one with a focused patience I recognized as something learned, not natural, the same way I'd learned it. We were driving back from Auburn on a Thursday afternoon when he started talking about his daughter. Her name was Maya. She was 7. She lived with her mother in Spokane, and Ryan saw her once a month if the schedule allowed it, and if her mother didn't have a reason to say no. He didn't say what the reason usually was. He talked about Maya the way you talk about something you're not sure you deserve, carefully, at a distance, like he was describing someone else's kid. She liked drawing. She was good at math. She'd asked him once why he didn't live with them, and he told her it was because of work. That's what I said, he said, looking out the passenger window. Work. I didn't ask him to clarify. I knew what the real answer was. Same reason I had a 1-bedroom in Burien with nothing in it but a mattress and a card table. Same reason neither of us had anyone waiting when we got home. We stopped talking about it after that. The highway stretched out ahead of us, flat and hot under the afternoon glare, and neither of us said anything for the next 40 minutes. The work order for the Ellensburg job came through on a Monday. I was sitting in my apartment when my phone buzzed. A text from Baker with an address and a name. Victorian on Pearl Street. Gregory Nelson, 81. Found by a neighbor 3 weeks after the fact. 2nd floor master bedroom. Natural causes, the coroner's report said, which meant he died in bed and stayed there while a Washington summer did what a Washington summer does. I called Ryan. He picked up on the 2nd ring. Ellensburg, I said. You available tomorrow? Yeah. It's a bad one. 3 weeks in heat. There was a pause. Not hesitation, just Ryan taking a second to register what that meant. I'll meet you at the shop, he said. 6 a.m. I hung up and looked at the address again. Pearl Street. I'd driven through Ellensburg a few times but didn't know the area. It didn't matter. The house would look like every other house we'd worked. The job would feel like every other job. You showed up, you opened the door, and you dealt with what was inside. I set the phone down on the card table and sat there for a while, looking at the wall. The apartment was quiet. It was always quiet. That's what I'd paid for. We pulled into the driveway at 7:30. The house was a Victorian. 2 stories. White paint gone gray in patches where the wood underneath had started to rot. The porch sagged on one side. The windows on the second floor had sheets hung behind them, visible through the glass as pale squares of fabric that hadn't been opened in years. Diane Foster was waiting by the front steps with a clipboard. Mid-50s, wireframe glasses, hair pulled back in a way that looked more efficient than styled. She didn't introduce herself, just handed me the work order and a pen. Sign here, she said, and here. I signed both lines. She took the clipboard back and pulled a key from her jacket pocket, then unlocked the front door and pushed it open about 6 inches. The smell came out immediately. Not the worst I'd dealt with, but close. Door stays unlocked while you're working, she said. Lock it when you leave for the day. You have access to the first and second floors. Kitchen, living room, bedrooms, bathrooms, anywhere you need to work. Understood, I said. She looked at me for a second, then at Ryan, then back at me. Leave the basement door alone. I waited for her to explain. She didn't. The basement door, I said. Correct. It stays closed. You don't open it. You don't go down there. That's not part of the scope of work. Ryan shifted his weight beside me but didn't say anything. Is there something in the basement we need to know about? I asked. No, Diane said. There's nothing in the basement. Leave it alone. She handed me the key, got back in her car and left. Ryan and I stood there in the driveway for a minute, looking at the house. The smell was still coming out through the open door, thick and sweet and wrong in a way that bypassed your brain and went straight to your stomach. 3 weeks in July, Ryan said. Yeah, we went back to the truck and started suiting up. Tyvek suits first, the white coveralls that zipped from ankle to throat and made every job feel like you were working inside a plastic bag. Then the respirators, half-face cartridge masks that sealed tight against your jaw and made your own breath sound like it was coming from someone standing behind you. Gloves next, nitrile pulled over the cuffs of the suit and taped down, then booties over our boots, also taped. By the time we were done, we looked like we were prepping for a moon landing, not a dead man's bedroom. I grabbed the equipment duffel from the truck bed, and Ryan took the disposal bags. We walked up the porch steps and through the front door. The smell was worse inside. It always is. Outside, it dissipates. Inside, it settles into the walls and the carpet and the air itself, and you can feel it coating the back of your throat even through the respirator. The front hallway was dim, curtains drawn, no lights on, and the floorboards creaked under our feet as we moved into the living room. The furniture was old but maintained. A couch with wooden armrests, a recliner facing a television that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks whose spines had faded to the same shade of yellow. Everything was clean. No dishes in the sink when I glanced into the kitchen. No trash piled up. Gregory Nelson had kept the house the way people used to keep houses before keeping a house stopped being something people did. Then I saw the locks. The bedroom door off the living room had a sliding bolt mounted on the outside. Brass, heavy duty, the kind you'd use on a shed or a gate. I walked over and looked closer. There was a second bolt on the inside of the door frame, visible through the gap where the door hung slightly ajar. Both sides. The door could be locked from the hallway or from inside the bedroom. I moved into the hallway. The bathroom door had the same setup, bolts on both sides. So did the linen closet. So did what looked like a storage room at the end of the hall. Ryan, I said. He came over and looked where I was pointing. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just studied the bolts the way you'd study a piece of equipment you didn't recognize. Old man was probably paranoid, he said finally. People who die alone in houses like this, they get that way. I nodded. It was a reasonable explanation, but I kept looking at the bolts, at the screws that held them in place, at the way they were mounted on both sides of every door, locking yourself in, locking yourself out, giving yourself the option to do either from either side. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter's mother was like that, toward the end." I looked at him. He was still staring at the bolt. Before I understood, it wasn't paranoia, he said. Then he picked up the equipment duffel and headed toward the stairs. I stayed in the hallway for another few seconds. There was one more door I hadn't checked yet. The basement door, halfway down the hall on the left. Diane Foster had been specific about it. "Leave it alone, don't open it." I walked over and looked at it anyway. It had bolts. 3 of them, heavier than the ones on the other doors. Industrial sliding bolts, the kind you'd use to secure a gate or a barn door. All 3 were thrown. All 3 were mounted on the hallway side. I crouched down and looked at the screws. They were bright. No rust, no oxidation. The wood around them was clean. The holes fresh enough that I could still see the pale grain where the drill bit had gone in. These bolts had been installed recently. Within the last year, maybe 2. 40 years Gregory Nelson had lived in this house. 40 years. And sometime in the last stretch of them, he decided the basement door needed 3 heavy-duty bolts on the outside. I stood up and looked at the door again. Then I looked back at the bedroom door behind me, at the bathroom door, at the linen closet. All of them had bolts on both sides. This one didn't. This one only locked from the hallway, not from inside the basement, just from out here, where Gregory Nelson would have been standing when he threw them. I heard Ryan's footsteps on the stairs above me. "We doing this or not?" he called down. "Yeah," I said. I picked up the disposal bags and followed him up to the second floor, the bright screws still sitting in the back of my mind, like a sentence I couldn't finish reading. The master bedroom door was closed. Ryan pushed it open and the smell hit us. Sharper, heavier, the smell underneath all the other smells. This was where it had happened. This was the room. The bed was against the far wall, stripped down to the mattress. The stain was where you'd expect it. A dark, irregular shape spread across the center and down one side, the fabric pulled tight over whatever had soaked through into the padding beneath. The floor around the bed was clean. Gregory Nelson had died in his bed, not on the floor, and that made the work simpler, not easier, simpler. Ryan set his equipment down by the door and looked at the walls. I looked at them too, and that's when I saw the scratches. They covered every wall in the room, floor to ceiling, corner to corner, thousands of them. Narrow lines cut into the paint and plaster, overlapping, crisscrossing, packed so densely in some places that the wall looked textured from a distance, not words, not symbols, just lines, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, some of them shallow, some deep enough that I could see the bare plaster underneath. They looked like they'd been made with something narrow and rigid, a nail maybe, or the edge of a screwdriver. Something Gregory Nelson could hold in his hand while he dragged it across the wall, over and over, until the paint gave way. I stepped closer to the wall nearest me and ran my gloved hand along the surface. The scratches were rough under my palm, the edges sharp where the tool had scraped through. Some of them were old. The exposed plaster had darkened, dust settled into the grooves. Others were newer, the lines still pale, the paint curled back in thin strips along the edges. This hadn't been done all at once. This had been done over years. "Jesus," Ryan said behind me. I turned. He was standing in the center of the room looking at the wall opposite the bed, the wall that faced the door. That wall had more scratches than the others, denser, more deliberate. The lines packed so close together they formed a solid band of texture from about waist height to just above my head. It looked less like random marking and more like something methodical, something with a pattern. "Old man was sick," Ryan said. "Had to be." I didn't say anything. I was looking at the band of scratches, trying to see if there was a structure to it, trying to see if the lines meant something. Ryan walked over to the bed and crouched down beside the stain. He opened the first disposal bag and started pulling out the tools we'd need. Scrapers, enzyme solution, absorbent pads. Standard procedure. I kept looking at the walls. "Doesn't look sick," I said. Ryan glanced up at me. "What?" "It doesn't look sick," I said. "It looks like counting." He stopped what he was doing, stood up, walked back to the wall, and looked at it the way I was looking at it. Not as damage, but as information. Counting what? He asked. I don't know. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, my daughter's mother did something like this. Toward the end, she kept notebooks. Pages and pages of tallies, little marks in rows. I thought she was losing it, thought it was the drugs or the paranoia or whatever else was going on with her. He stopped. Wasn't that though? I waited. He didn't finish the thought. What was it? I asked. He shook his head. Doesn't matter now. He went back to the bed and started working. I stood there a moment longer, looking at the scratches, and then I started looking at the distribution. They weren't uniform. The wall that faced the door, the wall that faced the direction of the basement, had more scratches than the others, a lot more. The other 3 walls were marked, but not like that one. That one was deliberate. That one was where Gregory Nelson had spent his time. I thought about the bolts, the double-sided bolts on every door in the house, bedroom doors, bathroom doors, even the linen closet. Bolts on both sides so you could lock yourself in or lock something out, depending on which side of the door you were standing on. A man who wanted options, a man who wanted to be able to seal a room from within. And then I thought about the basement door. 3 bolts, all on the hallway side. No bolts on the inside. No option to lock it from below. Gregory Nelson had been counting something, keeping track of something, and whatever it was below him. In the basement, behind a door he'd reinforced late in his life, after 40 years in this house, and bolted only from the outside. I picked up a scraper and went to work on the mattress. The stain was old and set, the fabric stiff where the fluids had dried. I worked the blade under the edge and started cutting, sectioning the mattress into pieces small enough to fit in the disposal bags. Ryan worked the other side, neither of us talking. The scratches stayed in my peripheral vision the whole time, a static presence on every wall, the dense band on the far wall pulling my attention every time I glanced up. It took us 3 hours to finish the room, and I remember most of it in fragments. The way work like that breaks down into small, repetitive motions that your hands do while your mind goes somewhere else. I remember cutting the mattress into sections, the blade catching on the coils inside, my left hand bracing the fabric while my right sawed through. The pieces were heavier than they looked. I had to drag each one to the disposal bag rather than lift it, the fabric leaving a faint trail through the dust on the floor. Ryan worked across from me, and for a while the only sound was the scrape of our blades and the rustle of plastic when we sealed a bag. The carpet under the bed had to come up. I pulled back the corner and saw the stain had soaked through the pad and into the subflooring. A dark shadow spread across the wood grain. I poured enzyme solution over it and watched it pool in the low spots, the chemical smell cutting through the rot. My knees were sore from kneeling. I stood up and went to the walls while the solution sat, scrubbing the scratches with a wet rag, trying to get the dust out of the grooves. The rag caught on the rough edges. I had to press hard to get into the deeper lines, and the water turned gray almost immediately. I kept glancing at the band of scratches on the far wall, the dense, methodical section that faced the basement, and every time I looked at it I thought about Gregory Nelson standing here with a nail or a screwdriver in his hand, dragging it across the plaster one line at a time, keeping count. I didn't know what he'd been counting, but I knew he'd been counting it for years. By the time we hauled the last bag out into the hallway, it was past noon. The house was quieter now, the smell less oppressive with the windows open and the worst of the material removed. Ryan set his bag down and pulled his respirator off, his face slick with sweat underneath. I did the same. We stood there in the hallway, breathing, looking at nothing in particular. And then I looked down the hall and saw the basement door again. It was at the far end, past the bathroom and the linen closet. The 3 bolts were still thrown. I could see them from here. Heavy, bright, new. The door itself was old, the paint yellowed and chipped, but the bolts were recent. Gregory Nelson had installed them within the last year or 2, and he'd installed them on the hallway side only. The double-sided bolts on every other door made sense now. They weren't paranoia, they were options. Gregory Nelson had been managing something, keeping track of something, and he'd wanted the ability to lock himself into a room if he needed to, or to lock something out, depending on where it was, depending on what was happening. But the basement door didn't have bolts on both sides. It only had bolts on the hallway side. Because at some point, Gregory Nelson had decided he would never be on the other side of that door again. Whatever was down there, he was done going down to meet it. He was done being in the same room with it. All he wanted at the end was to keep it locked in. Ryan picked up his bag and started toward the stairs. I picked up mine and followed him, the basement door sitting at the far end of the hallway behind us, its 3 bright bolts still holding it shut. We were maybe 5 hours into the job when the sound started. I was working the north wall. Ryan was bagging ruined carpet from the corner by the window, and the sound came from below us, not the pipes and timber settling you get in old houses, not the creak of joists adjusting to weight, something moving through a space it knew well, something that had been down there long enough that movement was its own reason, not going anywhere in particular, just moving because that's what it did. I stopped working. Ryan stopped working. We looked at each other across the ruined bedroom, the respirators making it hard to read faces, but I could see his eyes. The sound kept going beneath us. Not loud, not frantic, patient. It was the patience that got to me. Whatever was down there had time. It had been down there a long time already, and it wasn't in any hurry now. Ryan pulled his respirator down. I did the same. We stood there listening. The sound moved from one end of the basement to the other. I could track it through the floorboards, and then it stopped. We waited. It started again, coming back the way it had gone. Ryan said, "You hear that?" I said I did. He looked at the floor between his boots for a long moment, then back at me. I watched the arithmetic happen in his face. Not panic, just the math. He'd already lost most of what he had. Spokane, the daughter, the years at Cedar Ridge, the jobs that came after. He was weighing what it would cost to lose the rest. The wage, the work, the one thing he'd found that didn't ask questions. I understood the scratches then. Not all at once, but the way you understand something when the last piece drops into place and you realize you've been looking at it wrong the whole time. Gregory Nelson hadn't been counting days. He'd been counting this. 40 years of this sound moving beneath him, and he'd marked every time he heard it. Keeping track, making sure it was still down there, making sure it hadn't moved up. The sound stopped again. We waited. It didn't start back. I said, "Go." Ryan looked at me. I said it again, quieter this time, the way I'd learned to say things at Cedar Ridge when I needed them heard and not questioned. "Go. I'll call Diane from the van. Job's incomplete. I'll be right behind you." Ryan didn't move. He was still doing the math. I said, "I'll be right behind you." He picked up his bag. He stood there another few seconds, looking at me, then at the floor, then back at me. Then he nodded once and walked out of the room. I listened to his footsteps on the stairs. I listened to the front door open and close. I listened to the silence that came after. The sound started again. I stood in the hallway looking at the basement door, the 3 bright bolts still thrown, all mounted on the hallway side. The screws knew enough that the metal hadn't oxidized yet. Gregory Nelson had reinforced this door late, maybe in the last year, maybe in the last 2, and he'd done it knowing he would never be on the other side of it again. Every other door in the house had bolts on both sides, because every other door was part of the system he'd built to manage this, lock himself into a room when he needed to, lock something out when it moved too close. 40 years of options, 40 years of scratches on the wall, counting movements, keeping track, but the basement door only had bolts on one side, because at some point Gregory Nelson had decided the system didn't need that option anymore. He was done going down. He was done being in the same room with it. All he wanted, at the end, was to keep it locked in. The sound below was the sound of something that had been waiting 40 years for him to come back. I took hold of the first bolt. I pulled the first bolt back. Metal on metal, the sound louder than I expected in the empty hallway. The bolt clattered when I dropped it on the floor. I threw the second one, then the third. 3 bright bolts and a line on the hardwood where Gregory Nelson had walked for 40 years, keeping something sealed below him. I'd made a decision standing in that hallway, and the decision was this. If it was coming out, it was coming out now, while I was still in the building and could see it. I learned that at Cedar Ridge. The thing you can't see is always worse than the thing you can. People lose their minds over what might be behind a door. What's actually behind the door you can look at. You can measure it. You can decide what to do about it. Gregory Nelson had spent 40 years not looking, counting from the room above, reinforcing locks, scratching lines into plaster to keep track of movements he could hear but wouldn't go down to meet. I wasn't going to do that. I was going to open the door. I pulled it open. The smell that came up was old air and concrete and something underneath that I didn't have a name for. Not decay, not rot, just old. The stairwell went down into darkness, and I couldn't see the bottom from where I stood. I heard it before I saw it. The sound of movement on the stairs. Not fast, not rushing. Just the sound of something large pulling itself up step by step, the way a thing moves when it's been in one place long enough that movement is its own purpose. Patient, deliberate. It had been waiting a long time. It came into the light at the top of the stairs, and I looked at it. Large. Pale. The edges of it weren't clean. It pulled the shadows around itself, or the shadows moved with it. I couldn't tell which. It didn't have a face the way a face is supposed to look, but it had something that served the same function, and that something was looking at me. I didn't move back. I'd learned at Cedar Ridge that the worst thing you can do when something is testing you is flinch. Flinching is what gets a person hurt. You hold your ground. You look at the thing that's in front of you and you don't blink, and eventually the thing decides whether you're worth the effort. Most of the time, if you don't flinch, it decides you're not. So I stood in the doorframe and I looked back at it. It stopped on the stairs. Not at the top. Halfway up, where the light from the hallway hit the edge of it and didn't go any further. It stayed there, and it looked at me. And I looked at it, and I let myself understand what I was looking at. Not malevolent. Not hunting. Waiting. It had been waiting 40 years for Gregory Nelson to come back down those stairs, and Gregory Nelson had not come back, and now there was someone else standing in the hallway where Gregory Nelson used to stand. The double-sided bolts made sense now. Not to keep it out. To give Gregory Nelson the option. Any room in the house, he could lock himself in or lock it out, and the choice was his. He could be with it or apart from it on his own terms. The basement door only had bolts on one side, because at some point, maybe a year ago, maybe 2, Gregory Nelson had stopped being willing to make that choice. He wasn't going down anymore. He was done being in the same room with it. All he wanted was to keep it locked in. But he was gone now, and the locks were off. I spoke out loud. My voice sounded wrong in the empty hallway, flat and too loud through the respirator, but I said it anyway. He's gone. The thing on the stairs didn't move. Been gone 3 weeks, I said. He's not coming back. I watched it. I don't know if it understood the words. I don't know if it understood anything. But it went still in a way it hadn't been still before. And I knew it had heard me. I stepped past it. Not around. Past. Close enough that I had to turn sideways in the stairwell. Close enough that the edge of my shoulder came within inches of the edge of it. The cold coming off it raised every hair on my arms through the Tyvek suit. A cold that didn't feel like temperature, just absence. The smell was stronger there. Old air, concrete, something underneath I still didn't have a name for. It didn't move. I went down the stairs past it, one step at a time, my hand on the rail. I could feel it behind me the whole way down, not following. Just there. I reached the ground floor and crossed the hallway to the front door. My hands were shaking when I pushed the door open. I noticed that. I noticed the daylight outside, too bright after the dim hallway. I noticed the sound of my own breathing inside the respirator, too fast, too shallow. I walked down the porch steps and across the driveway to the van. Ryan was sitting in the driver's seat with the engine running and his phone in his hand. I pulled the respirator off my face before I got to the van. My hands were still shaking. I noticed that. Ryan looked at me through the windshield, then reached across and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. I got in. He put the van in gear and pulled out onto Pearl Street without saying anything. We drove west. The afternoon light was flat and white through the windshield, the kind of light that makes everything look overexposed. I kept my hands on my knees and focused on breathing evenly until my chest stopped feeling tight. Ryan didn't ask what happened. I didn't tell him. We got onto I-90 westbound and he drove the way he always drove. Steady, no hurry, hands at 10 and 2. The highway opened up ahead of us, trees on both sides, billboards every half-mile advertising injury lawyers and fireworks outlets. I watched the mile markers go past and counted them without meaning to. 94, 93, 92. Around milepost 85, Ryan put on his turn signal and took the exit for CLE Elim. I didn't ask why. He pulled into the parking lot of a Denny's just off the ramp and stopped the van in a space near the back, away from the entrance. He left the engine running. We sat there. Through the window I could see people inside the restaurant, a waitress refilling coffee, a man in a ball cap reading something on his phone. Normal people doing normal things. I looked at them for a while, and then I pulled out my phone and called Diane Foster. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mitchell." "Job's incomplete," I said. "We're not coming back." There was a pause, not a long one, just enough for her to recalibrate. "You were contracted for full remediation. The work order specifies." "I know what it specifies." "Then you understand I'll withhold payment." I looked out the windshield at the Denny's sign, yellow letters bright against the overcast. "Do what you need to do, Mr. Mitchell. I'm telling you, I will withhold payment. You understand that?" "I do." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of her deciding whether to push harder or let it go. She let it go. "I'll be in touch with your supervisor," she said. "Okay." She hung up. I put the phone back in my pocket and sat there looking at the Denny's. Ryan hadn't moved. His hands were still on the wheel even though the van was in park. "What are you going to do?" he said. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Gregory Nelson in that house for 40 years, counting scratches into the walls, bolting doors from both sides, managing something in the basement that had been waiting the whole time for him to come back down. I thought about the thing on the stairs, patient and still, and the way it had looked at me when I told it he was gone. I thought about the cold coming off it, and the smell underneath the cold that I still didn't have a name for. "Same thing I've been doing," I said. Ryan nodded. He didn't ask what I meant. He put the van back in gear and pulled out of the parking lot onto the access road, then back onto the ramp for I-90 West. We drove the rest of the way to Seattle without talking. The light outside went from white to gold to gray as the sun dropped behind the trees. By the time we hit the city limits, it was almost dark. Ryan dropped me at my apartment in Burien a little after 8. I got out of the van and he drove off without saying goodnight. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and let myself into the apartment. It smelled like old carpet and the lemon cleaner the landlord used in the hallways. I dropped my keys on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a minute, not sure what to do next. I should have been wired. I should have been up all night thinking about the house and the thing on the stairs and Diane Foster's voice on the phone telling me she'd withhold payment. I should have been a lot of things. Instead, I walked into the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, and unlaced my boots. I pulled them off one at a time and set them on the floor next to the nightstand. Then I lay down on top of the covers with my clothes still on and closed my eyes. I didn't think I'd sleep, but I did. Not well. I kept waking up every hour or so, my chest tight, my hands curled into fists on the mattress, but I slept. I called Ryan the next morning, 9:30, which was late enough that he'd be up, but early enough that he wouldn't have left for whatever the next job was. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "I need to tell you what I did after you left," I said. He didn't say anything. I could hear traffic in the background, so he was already in the van or near it. "I opened the basement door," I said. Still nothing. I kept going. I pulled all 3 bolts and dropped them on the floor. Then I opened the door. Something came up the stairs. Not fast, patient. It stopped halfway and looked at me. I looked back at it. Then I told it Gregory Nelson was gone, that he'd been gone 3 weeks, and he wasn't coming back. Then I walked past it and left. The silence went on long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Ryan said, "I believe you." I hadn't realized until he said it that I'd been waiting to hear whether he would. He was quiet again. Then he said, "That's what I understood about Nadia." Nadia, his daughter's mother. He'd never said her name before. "The doors," he said. "The records. She wasn't tracking nothing. She was managing something real. I couldn't see it, but she could, and she was doing what she had to do to live with it." He stopped there. I didn't push. After a moment, he said he had to go, and I told him I'd see him at the next job, and we hung up. That was the end of it for 3 weeks. Then Diane Foster called me back. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but I picked up anyway. Her voice came through clipped and tight, the way it had been the first time we met in the driveway on Pearl Street. "Mr. Mitchell," she said. "Diane Foster." I'm calling to inform you that I hired another crew to complete the work at the Nelson property." I didn't say anything. I set my coffee down on the counter and waited. "They finished the job 2 days ago," she said. "Full remediation, top to bottom. They documented everything." "Okay," I said. "They found it empty," she said. "The basement, empty." She said it like an accusation. Like the emptiness proved I'd walked off the job for no reason. Like I owed her an explanation for why there'd been nothing there when the second crew went down. I looked out the kitchen window at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into the trunk of a sedan. A kid on a bike rode past on the sidewalk. Normal morning, normal people doing normal things. "I'm glad to hear that," I said. I wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth, because the basement being empty meant it had left. The thing that had been in that house for 40 years, the thing Gregory Nelson had counted, had bolted doors against, had reinforced the basement against in his final years, was gone. I told it Gregory Nelson wasn't coming back, and it had left, but I didn't know where it went, and I wasn't certain whether telling a thing the truth about its situation releases it or just relocates it. Diane Foster was still talking, something about the completed work order, about how BioClean would be receiving full payment now that the job was done properly. I let her finish. Then I thanked her for the update and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand. What I had was this. I looked at it. I told it the truth. I walked past it. I left the house. I'm still here. I decided that was enough. Then I registered the gap between deciding something is enough and it actually being enough. The decision itself was the only mechanism by which anything had ever been enough for me. At Cedar Ridge, on the outside, in the van with Ryan driving west on I-90, the decision was the mechanism. It had gotten me this far, and this far was somewhere. The basement was empty. Gregory Nelson had spent 40 years counting movements from the room above, locking himself in and out of every room in his own house, reinforcing doors, managing something no one else could see. In the end, he died alone in the master bedroom with scratches on every wall, and the thing waited. And now it was gone. I looked at it. I told it the truth. I walked past it. I decided that was what happened, that the deciding was the mechanism, that the mechanism had gotten me this far. I set the phone down on the counter next to my coffee. The woman in the parking lot closed her trunk and got into the sedan. The kid on the bike was gone. I picked up my coffee and drank it. It was cold. I drank it anyway. This far was somewhere.